Peter Schiff Show.
Joining the program now is Ramesh Ponnuru. He is the senior editor at the National Review, or a senior editor. He's also a columnist for Time Magazine and the WashingtonPost.com. He's the author of the 2006 book, The Part of Death: The Democrats, the Media, the Courts, and the Disregard for Human Life. Ramesh, welcome to the Peter Schiff Show.
Thanks for having me on.
Oh, great. Thanks for coming on. So you are on basically to defend Ben Bernanke. Now, I happen to be a very big critic of Ben Bernanke. And I want to start off, you credit him for kind of putting out the fire here when it comes to the financial crisis. But do you blame the Fed at all for starting the fire in the first place? Do you look at the fact that it was Fed policy, artificially low interest rates, that inflated the real estate bubble in the first place, and that therefore led to the ensuing financial crisis when it burst? Do you look at that at all?
Oh, I think that if you look at it historically, Fed policy in the 80s, 90s, and 2000s was better than the way it had been in the 60s and 70s. But I agree with the premise of your question that the Fed kept interest rates too low, too long, was too loose during much of the last decade, and that did fuel the housing boom. Where I might disagree with you is I also think that starting really from mid-2008, maybe even a little bit earlier, the Fed tightened too much, and that this led to a crash that was much more severe than otherwise would have happened.
Well,
so while
again,
you say I'm a
by your own admission, though,
too.
Yeah, had they not left them so low. And I would argue that rates were not only too low during the decade that produced the housing bubble, but during the decade that produced the stock market bubble. Even though they weren't as low, they were lower than the free market would have otherwise set them. But if you admit now that in hindsight, and of course I was, you might have been arguing it at the time, I certainly was, back in 2001, 2, 3, 4, 5, that the rates were too low, that the Fed was in fact fueling a housing bubble that was going to have disastrous consequences when it ultimately popped. But if you acknowledge now that the Fed kept rates too low for too long, rates are even lower now, and they've been lower even longer than at any time when Greenspan was Fed chairman. So if you're criticizing Greenspan for keeping rates too low for too long, what about Bernanke, who's keeping them even lower for even longer?
Sure. Well, I guess you have to compare the interest rates that we've got and that the Fed is to some extent setting to, as you were saying, sort of what they would be in a free market. And my sense is that in a depressed economy, in a sluggishly growing economy, where expected returns are low, and that's the primary reason why we've got such low interest rates. That is, as Milton Friedman observed about Japan in the 1990s, when you have interest rates that are very low, sometimes that can be the sign of a Fed policy that is so tight that it chokes the life out of the economy and people don't expect to make returns.
But Ramesh, the economy, even if you use the government's numbers, the economy is expanding now. We're not in a recession. Yet interest rates, real interest rates, if you adjust them for the government's version of inflation, which I don't think is high enough, but even if you calculate real interest rates, they are the lowest they've ever been. The economy is not the weakest it has ever been. I mean, are you really saying that if the Fed was neutral, that the free market would be picking interest rates at zero right now, or would be setting a negative rate of interest right now without the Fed's influence?
Well, there are a couple issues there, and I think that's sort of as with any of these questions, it's hard to figure out sort of the counterfactual, what the free market situation would be. We have such an unfree market in so many ways, as I'm sure you'd agree. I think that you would have, well, I guess two things. No, it is certainly true that this is not the weakest economy we have ever had, but it is also true that we have, I think, long-term expectations of slow growth in a way that we haven't had for a very, very, very long time, maybe not since the 1930s.
growth is only one part of the equation. If you look at interest rates as a sign of credit worthiness, certainly the more credit worthy you are, the lower your rate's going to be. If you look at the U.S. as the position of a debtor, if you look at our net position, we are certainly far less creditworthy today than we were at any time in our history, because we've never owed so much money relative to our capacity to repay, without resorting to printing. And of course, that just means much higher future rates of inflation as we default, through inflation. So given this very diminished fiscal position of the United States, we have never been as less creditworthy than we are today. Why aren't interest rates higher to reflect our poor ability to repay?
Well, I think partly it's because so many other countries are even worse shape than ours, and that there's been, as a result, a flight to relative safety. Even though, as you suggest, there are obviously some serious concerns about.
But relative safety. Look, relative safety isn't safe. If there's a tiger in one cage, and so I decide to go into the cage with a lion because I think he's not as hungry. I mean, I'm not safe there. I mean, I just assume not go in either cage. I mean, nobody is forced to own U.S. Treasuries just because they don't want to own, Greek bonds. They can own gold. They don't have to own any of this stuff.
Yeah, well, the one of these symptoms, and David Beckworth has done a lot of work on this he's one of the market monitorist bloggers. I think actually that's the name of his site, the Market Monitorist. He argues that what I and he diagnose as tightness on the part of the Fed is creating a global shortage of safe assets.
What tightness?
And that's one of the reasons, again, why you've got, I suppose in a way, a lot of the folks who sort of are arguing that the Fed's too loose would say that the Fed has kind of been subsidizing the Treasury. And I would sort of say the same thing, but from the opposite direction.
But, you don't see any damage to the economy structurally. Let's assume the Fed is getting interest rates too low. Let's assume that the market would have them higher so that there would be more of an incentive to save and not as much of an incentive to go out and gamble or borrow. And then maybe we'd have less spending and we'd have more investment and more production. You don't see any negative structural consequences to the U.S. economy of the Fed making a mistake and having rates too low?
Well, I think there are structural damages being inflicted by the Fed and certainly by Congress and the president as well. I would say, look, just to go back to the challenge the premise and then answer your question a little more directly, I would say if you had an appropriate Fed policy, you would have higher expectations of growth, you would have higher interest rates, and thus you would have higher returns to savers and investors. I think a lot of the damage that is being done by the Fed, I would say, is not so much the interest rates being too low as the unpredictability of what the Fed has been doing over the last few years. The fact that it is not constrained by any rules and it's just at the discretion of who happened to be at the Fed, I think that creates a lot of uncertainty, and I think that's been a problem.
I think they've been very predictably reckless and irresponsible. I mean, I think from that case, I think Wall Street is convinced that the cheap money is going to flow indefinitely. Consumers are convinced of that. I mean, we're told that rates are going to stay low indefinitely. So I think they have been predictable. They've been predictably wrong. One thing I want to ask you about, Ben Bernanke keeps saying that, hey, I can withdraw this liquidity whenever I want. No problem, no big deal. If inflation ever picks up, I can withdraw the liquidity as easily as I supplied it. Do you really think that that can possibly happen, given that we right now have a $16 trillion debt that is financed at an average rate of 2%, where a third of it matures in the next year? Do you think the Fed can go from the biggest buyer of treasuries in the world to the biggest seller, that the Fed can actually withdraw this liquidity, interest rates can rise, and the economy can absolutely absorb the cost, that the Treasury can afford to pay 5 or 6% interest on the national debt, that the banks can withstand that big an increase in interest rates, that homeowners can afford to pay their adjustable rate mortgages when rates go up like that?
Well, first of all, I would say they'd better, because if there's going to be an economic recovery, then interest rates will rise, and all of those things are going to happen.
Well, what if there's no recovery? I'm saying, what if inflation? You see, the Fed says that if inflation is too high, they're going to tighten.
Right.
So what if inflation comes back, but we don't get a recovery, which is possible? I mean, we had that in the 1970s. So what if we get stagflation and the Fed has to raise rates, even though maybe the unemployment rate is higher than it is today?
So I guess the question then would be, are there political constraints that prevent the Fed from doing what Bernanke says it would do in that event? And I think that, it's possible, but I'd also point out that, for example, the November 15th Cleveland Fed estimate of inflation expectations says that market expectations of inflation over the next decade are 1.5%. So this scenario doesn't seem like it's happening.
Well, what the market expects and reality are probably two separate things. I mean, the market expects a lot of things that don't happen. The market expected some crazy things in 2000 with respect to the stock market. It never happened. The market expected housing prices to keep going up in 2006. It didn't happen that way. And I think the market expects something, but they're not going to get it because there already is a lot of inflation. The average American is struggling to survive the inflation that the market thinks doesn't exist.
Well, I think you can look at particular prices where that's been the case, and you can look at particular factors that have led some relative prices to go up, but I don't think that you have had anything like a general inflation, and by any, I think, reasonable measure over the last few years, it's been low inflation by historical standards.
Well, I don't necessarily think so if we measured the price increases the way we did historically, but also you have to look at the context. We've had prices rising despite the fact that we had this huge economic contraction. Prices should have come down. We should have had a much bigger decline in prices. That would have helped the economy, but the Fed with cheap money prevented that beneficial development from occurring. And I think that you have other temporary factors that have been saving us from this inflation monster that the Fed has created, but that those factors are going to go away, and we're going to have to face the full wrath of the inflation that the Fed has created, and even worse, the consequences of trying to slay that dragon when it's so big and doing so much damage. And Ramesh, one of the reasons I think that we haven't really seen the extent of the inflationary impact on consumer prices in America, well, one is I just don't think that the CPI is actually capturing the extent of it. But also during the Depression in the 30s, consumer prices dropped by about a third. So if you lost your job or you lost some of your savings, either in the market or your cost of living went down. Food was a lot cheaper in the Depression than it was before. Energy was cheaper, but today food and energy are more expensive than they were when the financial crisis began. So you have all these unemployed Americans who are not only unemployed, but they have to pay more for the basic necessities of life. They're not getting a break the way they did in the 1930s. And I think one of the reasons that prices aren't even higher is because so much of the inflation has been exported to foreign countries. Central banks around the world are buying up all these dollars, and they're bidding up treasury prices instead of food prices or resource prices. And so we've been temporarily spared the full wrath of that inflation, but that I believe the appetite for U.S. treasuries abroad has its limits, and at some point the world is going to puke these things out. And all that money is going to come back like a tsunami, bidding up the price of everything that's not nailed down.
Well, to let me start with that Great Depression point and prices falling. If you'd had deflation, if you'd had prices falling at the level they did in the Depression, one of the prices that would have to fall would be wages. And when wage levels fall, we know that in a lot of cases, it's very hard to make markets for labor clear in that way, and you'd end up with a lot more unemployment even than we've had. Which of course
remember, the problem in the 1930s, the initial problem in the 1930s was that Hoover was trying to discourage businesses from cutting wages. The problem was wages weren't falling fast enough early in the Depression, and I think one of the reasons we have so much unemployment is because wages are still too high, unfortunately. Because if you have a surplus of unemployed workers, the reason that no one's hiring them is because it's too expensive. And so the only way to kind of clear that market would be to bring down the overall labor cost. A good portion of it is not wages, though, too. It's regulations, it's taxes, it's litigation expenses. It is very expensive to hire Americans, which is why a lot of people don't want to do it.
Right, but I mean, I guess the question is this. I mean, do you agree with most economists on the point that wages are sticky downward, that it's that they don't react quickly and frictionlessly to price shocks, especially going down?
Not necessarily. I think you have things like the minimum wage law that maybe makes them sticky, but I think if you didn't have the government interfering, and I think you have things like the unemployment compensation. I was watching a report on the news yesterday that said that UPS was not able to hire temporary workers. They have all these temporary jobs that are going unfilled because nobody will give up their unemployment benefits to take these jobs.
Yeah, look, and I agree with you on a lot of these, let's call them, I guess, supply-side factors. But I also think that a looser, if you will, policy which generated more robust economic recovery would make it more easy to reform some of these things, like scaling back. Then what do we have? 99 weeks of unemployment.
Yeah, but what if the loose monetary policy is contributing to the problems? What if the economy is going to be less robust long term because of the loose policy? Because the loose policies are
of our disagreement, right? I mean,
because aren't the loose policies encouraging more of the very activity that created the problem? Aren't we rewarding people for spending, consuming, gambling? Aren't we discouraging people from saving and investing? Aren't we enabling the government to get larger instead of forcing it to confront the enormity of the imbalances and shrink government spending? They don't have to do that because the Fed gives them an easy way out.
I would say that historically, some of your biggest periods of government expansion in the U.S. have been precisely at times of too tight monetary policy. Early 1930s, one of them, 2008, 2009, another. So I'd say actually it's exactly the other way around. But you're right. That's exactly the point of disagreement. If you're right about Fed policy being too loose and causing all these problems.
Well, the last thing, let me leave you with this.
It obviously won't help generate a more robust economic recovery.
We are going to have to tighten eventually, either because of inflation, because of growth, or a combination of both. How can the U.S. economy handle the interest burden at that point? Forget about the political elements, the reality. Let's assume in a couple of years the national debt is $20 trillion. And interest rates rise to, let's say, 7%. How can the U.S. government pay $1.4 trillion a year in interest on the national debt? And how can our banking sector, how can the housing sector withstand mortgage rates of, let's say, 8 or 9% on a fixed rate mortgage when the housing sector is now priced for mortgage rates of 3.5%?
That's going to be a huge problem, but it is not, I think, fundamentally a problem of excessively loose monetary policy right now. It's a problem that
of course it is.
We have had too many entitlements, and the political system keeps adding more entitlements.
But if interest rates weren't so low, we couldn't borrow all this money. If interest rates were higher right now, the deficits would have to stop. More people wouldn't be lured into the cheap mortgage pool. I mean, this is exactly what happened during the housing bubble. You admit that we kept interest rates too low. That caused the housing bubble, and when it burst, it was a disaster. Trust me, the imbalances that are building up now are bigger.
I don't admit that the Fed – look, I mean, my point is the low interest rates today is not a matter of loose Fed policy. It's a matter of a depressed economy, right? And again, that's just another point where you and I disagree with our fundamental economic analysis.
Yeah, well, all right. Well, we'll have to agree to disagree on that. We've reached the end of the segment. Hour 2 coming up. Thanks for joining us. We'll be right back.